You know, perhaps it's the slightly petty part of my personality, like, you know, that 5%. But recently, every time I've done a video, I just can't help but wanting to say, it is such a pleasure to have stood with Nikon 2 years ago before they were cool. Let me stop, y'all. What is good, my beautiful people? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we are going to be talking about how to get the best images with respect to video out of your Nikon Z8 and Z9. Now, this video is titled The Best Settings for Video on the Nikon Z8, Z9, something like that, but that's just for search purposes. That is a very big oversimplification of how to get the best images out of this camera. So that's why we're gonna really be breaking down everything I do to get the best images out of the camera, the tools, some of the settings that I use, and then even how I go about color grading this camera in post-production and the best software I feel you should be using to get the best images out of this camera. So first off, let's go ahead and start with the camera settings that I really think should not change. And the first thing that you're gonna wanna do, if you wanna get good images out of this camera, you need to be shooting in Nikon Log. Now it is 2024. The programs out there make color grading log footage a breeze, and that's the way you are going to get the best dynamic range out of this camera. But this leads us into the second setting that limits us because we are shooting in log. If you are shooting in log, you need to be at least shooting in a 10-bit codec. Now, the reason for this is because log video is actually HDR. And by definition, HDR video is wide gamut, so a wide color gamut, bigger than Rec. 709, and it's going to have 10 bits of color. And it also needs to be shot in log, right? So that's why it's gonna be futile to shoot 8-bit video on this camera if you're shooting Nikon Log. Now this does leave us with a couple of codecs, right? It leaves us with H.265, ProRes 422 HQ, ProRes RAW, and of course, my favorite, NRAW, Nikon RAW. Now, Nikon RAW gives you the best available frame rate options and resolutions on this camera, which is why for me, it's a no-brainer. This camera stays in Nikon Log. And to be honest, although space is generally a concern, I have no problem shooting 4K on this camera. There's very few instances when I actually need 8K, but if you have a project that requires 8K, then hopefully you also have the budget for the cards. But that being said, if you're shooting in just normal quality Nikon RAW, right? I think this card is half full. And if I'm just shooting in normal quality, I have an hour and 30 minutes of recording in Nikon RAW in 4K, and that's with a 328 gigabyte CF Express card. So just keep those things in mind, right? Those are going to be the two biggest things that you can do in camera to get the best quality video. Now we'll talk about how to go ahead and process that video a little bit later, but now let's go on to how we actually get the best images out of those profiles and those codecs, right? The codecs store the information, but Nikon Log is what does the heavy work here with respect to the dynamic range. And the thing about log is simple. You're gonna need to expose it correctly. And although the Z8 has some amazing built-in assist features, right, which includes being able to view your log video in a regular profile like Rec. 709, shooting on the back of the camera when you're trying to get the best dynamic range out of it just does not cut it. Here's the reason why. First, our screen on the back can only get so bright. So in some conditions, it may be hard to judge what your image actually looks like. And furthermore, the image on the back of the screen is limited with respect to the dynamic range of the screen, right? So the back of the screen isn't going to be able to capture that dynamic range as fully as, say, a monitor. This is why you will always find me using an external monitor when I'm exposing for video. This makes actually even choosing these camera settings a whole lot simpler. Now, even the Ninja V, which I use, doesn't capture the full beauty of the Z8's dynamic range or the Z9's dynamic range. but it gives you a much better leg up. And as you get to more expensive monitors, the more dynamic range that you will have on them. It's just really hard to find these small, tiny monitors with really great dynamic range, but it's really just to give you a starting point, right? Now, this monitor comes with an abundance of tools to help make sure that you are exposing your log profile correctly. And that was the biggest thing when it came to shooting log, is how do you expose for it, right? That's why people were getting muddy images, and a lot of people were scared a couple years ago. They simply weren't exposing log log correctly. Using a monitor solves this. The first thing that you're going to want to do with respect to video if you're shooting in RAW is going to be to set the profile to PQ in your monitor settings. Otherwise, you can have the Ninja V do the conversion from Nikon Log, but again, we're a RAW family over here. That's what makes this camera special, so that's what we will be using. Now, from there, the biggest thing to remember about Nikon Log and NRAW, right, is that you need to protect those highlights, right? There's a couple of methods I use to protect my highlights. The first one is going to be visually, right? If I look at the highlight and it's looking like it's blowing out, then I know I need to be cautious. So I'm going to use some other tools, right? The next tool I'm going to use is going to be the false color tool. This is going to allow me to see how hot those highlights are and if they actually are clipping. And if it says they're clipping, I'm going to switch the profile from PQ to native and really check to see, is there any information I will be able to squeeze out in post. This is assuming, right, we're in an uncontrolled lighting situation, which a lot of people who use these cameras will be if you're doing a lot of run and gun shooting. Now, the reason why we protect the highlights is simple. Digital video is always good about recovering those shadows, right? There are gonna be times when you need to sacrifice the highlights if you're clipping your shadows, right? The goal is to not clip anything, but you will be able to recover those shadows a lot easier, especially if you are shooting in RAW. Now, from here, your camera settings really should stay the same, right? Personally, with me, I use the 180-degree rule, which is a shutter speed of 1/50 if we're shooting in 24 FPS, 1/120 if we're shooting in 60 FPS, and 1/240 if we are shooting in 120 FPS, right? But once you know those rules, you are able to break them. So if you need to creatively break those rules, well, now that you know the rules, you know how to break them, and you learn the effects of what shutter speed does, right? Our aperture, right? We will change that if we need to let more light into the camera, for example, because we're too dark, or we use our aperture mainly to control our depth of field. How much of the background do you want in view, and how much do you want to isolate that subject? And then our ISO, our base ISO on this camera, or the native ISO I should say, is 800 when shooting in RAW. Now I keep that as low as possible, but if we are trying to balance all these factors, right? Protecting our highlights, but not clipping our shadows, letting our light in, right? We can use that ISO to fine tune where we need to be, keeping in mind that the trade-off is going to be some noise in the shadows. So those are the main things that I do when I'm actually shooting video on set and in the field, right? Now we make that switch over into how to process the footage. Honestly, guys, and this is gonna ruffle some feathers, perhaps, maybe not if you're on my channel, there's only one program you should be using to color grade your footage, and that is DaVinci Resolve. Here's why. We have to understand that programs like Final Cut Pro X and Adobe Premiere Pro are editors. Their color management software simply is not on par with DaVinci Resolve. And if you're shooting any type of RAW, and honestly, any type of 10-bit log footage, you're really doing yourself a disservice with how much information you're really going to be able to fine-tune out of that image. These profiles are built for color grading NLEs, and on the market there are two, DaVinci Resolve and FilmLight, also known as Baselight. Those will be your industry standards when it comes to color grading professionally. Now, if you are new to DaVinci Resolve, I'm gonna tell you guys a couple of things that I like to do just to get you started. The first thing is when you go into DaVinci Resolve, you're gonna wanna make sure you set up your color management properly. This is where the magic of Resolve really shines when you're shooting log or RAW video. You don't have to worry about color correcting that or using a LUT. We're gonna go into our project settings, which is under File, Project Settings, and then we're gonna go to the Color Management tab. And we're gonna switch DaVinci YRGB into DaVinci YRGB Color Managed. And then we're gonna use our color processing mode as HDR DaVinci Wide Gamut. This is going to take our log footage, right? And it's gonna bring it into a wider color working space that we're gonna be able to use whether it's log or RAW. Now the output color space is easy. It's whatever your monitor is set to. So that could be Rec 709 Gamma 2.4. In my case, Apple devices Rec 709A if you get that gamma shift, or HDR deliverables are going to be Rec 2020 and ST2084, or P3 and ST2084, and whatever nit value you are grading to in your monitor is set to. My OLED is calibrated back there for Rec 709 and HDR, but today we're gonna use Rec 709. After you go ahead and click that save button, boom, your initial color correction is done. You've gone from log now into whatever your output color space is. Now, I like to set up a few nodes here. The first 3 nodes are simple. I set up my first node for any type of noise reduction, which I may need to do. I'll go ahead and reduce the noise, figure out where I want it, then I'll turn it off, and I'll come back and fine tune it later. The next node I use is for sharpening. Now, this is a little bit contentious amongst the community. I say whatever works in your color grading workflow, you go ahead and do. It's all about how we're taught and how we're raised. Some people prefer to put sharpening at the end of their node tree because they don't want to mess up the quality of their key. For example, it may help them pull a tighter key if you have noisier footage, or it may mess with your perception of how the image actually looks if you sharpen first instead of waiting until after you're done grading. Personally, I keep it off until the end anyway, and if it does mess up my key, I'll go ahead and throw it on the end. Now from there, our third node is going to be any type of extra white balance that we'll do outside of our camera raw tab, right? Now, when we talk about the camera raw tab, this is when if we have an image that is just slightly underexposed in our shadow region, we can use that shadow slider to initially pull some of that information back before we start going into our node tree. This allows the input into the node tree to have those raised shadows so that we're working with that starting dynamic range instead of the darker one and kind of working in a counterintuitive manner, right? The same thing goes for our highlights and our color temperature. So after we have those 3 nodes, we then go into a parallel series. This is a simple node tree for you guys, right? And it just creates 3 parallel nodes, one for lift, gamma, and gain, or whatever color tools you want to work with. What this parallel series allows us to do is it allows us to make really non-destructive adjustments with respect to our lift, our gamma, and our gain in that series before we go on and create a new input. This allows me to go back and make an adjustment that affects just that area because we're in a parallel series instead of doing it in 3 consecutive series nodes. And I label them so I know where I'm at. So if I want to go back and make an adjustment later, or a director wants me to, we're good to go there. We then go on to, in my case, a second series of parallel nodes using lift, gamma, and gain as well, but this time it's gonna be for our color mixing. Now you can use HDR wheels here, you can use log wheels, whatever your favorite tool is, because they're all essentially the same with the exception of HDR wheels. They all just have different levels of control. Actually, even the HDR wheels are essentially the same. It's the level of control, right? Use whatever you want to do to mix the color and get the look that you're going for. But remember to always prioritize your skin tones. Now this is a pretty simple node tree to get started, but I have a couple more tricks up my sleeve I want to share with you guys, and one we're going to expand on in a later video coming up. The first one is going to be to get a little bit more of a cinematic saturation. Instead of using your saturation slider, which can become a little bit grotesque, we're going to use a method that actually adds a little bit more density. Simply put, after you've done your parallel series, go ahead and create another node, and then you're going to click on that node to bring up the menu, and you're going to change that node's color space to hue, saturation, and value, HSV. And then you're going to click on that node again to bring up the menu and change the channels and turn off 1 and channel 3. That way we're just left with the saturation slider, right? From there, you can go ahead and use the gain wheel to increase or decrease the saturation to your liking, but this adds just a little bit more density, right? Now, the other trick I want to share with you is perhaps you want to pass through FilmConvert, right? We're going to go ahead and create 3 nodes before our saturation node. In the first 2 nodes, we're going to put a color space transform, and in the middle node, we're going to go ahead and put FilmConvert, right? For the settings in the first node, we're gonna go ahead and change our input color space to our timeline, which is going to be DaVinci Wide Gamut and the DaVinci Intermediate. The output color space is going to be sRGB for both the color space and the gamma. In our third node, we're now gonna change our input color space to Rec 709 and then the gamma to gamma 2.2 because that's what FilmConvert outputs to, and then we're gonna go back into the DaVinci Intermediate, DaVinci Wide Gamut. And then you can go ahead and tweak FilmConvert to your liking, and you can use that saturation slider to add that filmic density that we love. There's a link in the description down below for 20% off of FilmConvert and Cinematch. Just go ahead and check that link in the description down below. Be sure to give me a big thumbs up, hit that subscribe button, turn on those post notifications if you have not, because we are going to be talking about that saturation trick a little bit more in depth because there's a couple more things we can do to fine tune it in our next video. Be sure to follow me on social media. The links are in the description down below, as well as the YouTube fam. Their links are also in the description down below. My beautiful people, now more than ever, if you're ever feeling uninspired, uncreative, or just want to give up on life, remember, every day airplanes take off against the wind. Keep climbing, stay inspired, guys. And as always, stay fabulous. My name is Sydney. I'll see you beautiful people next time. Peace out.